Today's learning objectives are that you will be able to describe the atomic models associated with Democritus, Dalton, Thomson, Rutherford, Chadwick, and Bohr, and that you guys will be able to draw and label the atomic models that correspond to each of the individuals mentioned previously. So around 400 BC, Democritus, who was a Greek philosopher, theorized that matter could be divided into smaller and smaller units until you got to a point that it was no longer dividable. And at this point, he said that was the simplest form of matter, and he called this simplest form of matter atomos, which means uncuttable. And this is where we get our current name for the atom. Now, understand it's 400 BC. Democritus hasn't done any research or any experimental evidence, but at this time he has postulated that something very simple makes up all the matter surrounding us. So his model of the atom would honestly just be a simple sphere with no additional particles or anything that makes it up. So basically his model of the atom would just be a simple sphere like this. Now this brings us to our next individual who came many, many years later. So thousands of years later, in the early 1800s, John Dalton was running experiments, analyzing the world around him, just definitely an individual in love with learning about the world around him. Now through his observations, his experiments, and of course his theorizing, Dalton came up with what is known today as Dalton's atomic theory. And each of Dalton's postulates are basically outlined in the space below. Now, the one I want you to focus on most at this point is his first one here that says all matter consists of tiny atoms. So at this point, basically early 1800s, thousands of years later, Dalton is still agreeing with what Democritus has said about the atom. Okay? And so his atomic model would once again be a very simple sphere as the simplest form of matter that makes up every other thing around us. Okay, so not a whole lot of progression at this point in time. However, he is doing other experimental analyses that actually will be things that get discussed later on in future chapters. So around almost 100 years later, after Dalton formed his postulates, J.J. Thomson came around and decided to run something known as the cathode ray tube experiment. And in this process, he figured out that there were simpler things that make up atoms. And what this thing that he discovered was the electron. And the electron led to his model of the atom, which was called the plum pudding model. And the reason why it was called the plum pudding is because apparently at the time plum pudding was a meal that people would consume, or a dish rather. And so what he said is that there were negative particles, the electrons, surrounded by basically a positive matrix, as you can see here, with basically just a diffuse charge, positive charge, and stuck inside this charge are these negatively charged particles that are what he discovered in his cathode ray tube experiment. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's look at the experiment. So Thomson's cathode ray tube experiment consisted of an evacuated glass tube that had metal electrodes on the interior. And what he had connected to those metal electrodes was a voltage source. And so what he would do is he would run a voltage or run a current through the metal electrodes. And what he saw every time he ran the experiment was that basically a ray or something that looked like a beam of light would go from one end of the tube to the other. And he ran this experiment over and over. He even changed out the metal electrodes for different types of metals. And what he saw every single time was a ray going from one side to the other. Okay, and so this got him questioning, hey, where is this coming from? It seems like it's happening with all these different types of metals. Have I found something here that is, undiscovered? So what he then did is he ran the experiment, but this time he applied an external electrical field. And what ended up happening is when he applied the electrical field and allowed the ray to basically be emitted, what happened is that the ray would always curve towards the positive side of the electric field. And so it didn't matter what metal he tried, it didn't matter what the source was. Every single time he ran this experiment, the ray would bend up towards the positive end. So what he concluded from analyzing or observing this ray was that there are particles in the ray that have a negative charge. And so this led him to call these charged particles electrons and come up with what is known as his plum pudding model. So, this is late 1800s, early 1900s, and we now have our first subatomic particle, the electron, inside our atom. Okay, so we've come to understand that atoms are in fact not the smallest thing that makes up our matter. So around the same time as Thomson was looking at the electron, Rutherford is doing experiments that leads to his discovery of the nucleus. Okay, and his experiment is the gold foil experiment. And we're going to talk about this gold foil experiment and basically analyze how he was able to come to the conclusion of a nucleus being present in our atom. Rutherford's experiment was basically comprised of an alpha emitter, which produces positively charged alpha particles, and a very thin piece of gold foil, as well as a detector. Okay, and so what Rutherford expected, based on the accepted model of the time, which was the plum pudding model, is that the positively charged particles would flow through the atoms, the gold atoms in the foil, uninterrupted. So basically expected the gold to not disrupt or disturb the ray, or the alpha particle ray, and basically just pass right on through. Okay, and so when he ran the experiment, he was very surprised. Okay, so when he ran the alpha particles into the gold foil, what happened is most of them passed through. Okay, but a good portion of them deflected at various different angles, and some even bounced back. So what he concluded from his analysis and his observations was that there must be something dense and positive somewhere inside these atoms that is causing the deflections and the bounce backs. And so what he concluded was that there was a positively charged nucleus centralized in the middle of the atom, and that most of the atom was in fact comprised of empty space, which is why most of the alpha particles actually went straight through. Okay, and so at this point he has disproven the plum pudding model and basically advanced our atomic theory. So his model of the atom is going to look like what we see down here. Basically, we have our atom, we have electrons, okay, which Thomson helped us out with, okay, and we have a small positively charged nucleus that contains positively charged subatomic particles called protons. Okay, so Rutherford has advanced the atomic model and given us an additional subatomic particle that comprises the atom. So as Niels Bohr comes into the picture, we have protons, we have electrons, and basically through some experiments, Bohr established that electrons actually move around the nucleus, okay, in different orbits, okay, and these orbits have discrete or specific distances from the nucleus, okay, and they also have specific energy values. Okay, so with Bohr's model, we have electrons in specific orbits, basically like a planetary model with the Earth and other planets orbiting the sun, and in this case the electrons orbiting the nucleus. And basically his analyses or his experiments and analyses led to an advance in the atomic model in the sense that electrons are not just randomly distributed around the nucleus, but in fact have specific locations. Now, later on, in the 1930s, James Chadwick, he ended up discovering something called the neutron, and he won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his studies and his analyses. But basically, the neutron is a neutral particle that exists in the nucleus. Okay, and basically, it's a relatively heavy subatomic particle, and we will talk more about that when we talk about atomic masses and things of that sort. But basically, by the time Chadwick comes around, our model of the atom is very, very advanced. So we have a nucleus, okay, and in that nucleus we have protons. Okay, we also now, due to Chadwick's contributions, we have neutrons. Okay, and then around that nucleus are basically orbits that electrons reside in and orbit said nucleus. So we have electrons, okay, we have protons, okay, and of course we have neutrons. Okay, and so our electrons are negatively charged, our protons are positively charged, and our neutrons, of course, have no charge or are neutral. Okay, so this actually comprises all of the subatomic particles that we will be discussing, and basically is very similar to our modern day model of the atom. However, we'll talk about small adjustments and more specific adjustments in the future. So the modern model, it agrees with protons being in the nucleus, neutrons being in the nucleus, electrons outside of the nucleus, and electrons orbiting the nucleus in discrete orbits. However, some changes will occur here with respect to those orbits. The orbits actually don't exist in these like concentric circles that Bohr suggested. There are actually various shapes. There's s orbitals, p orbitals, d orbitals, which are actually what we call the location of atoms. And we'll discuss that in more detail in future lectures. So here we have a nice overview of the various models of the atom. We have Dalton's atom, and this is also Democritus's model of the atom. We have Thomson's plum pudding model. We have Rutherford's model of the atom. We have Bohr's model as well, okay? And then the current atomic model, which of course has neutrons, which were contributed by Chadwick. Okay, so make sure you're able to connect the individual with the specific drawing, be able to draw and label each of these. Also, please make sure that you guys are able to label the parts and indicate the appropriate charges for various subatomic particles in each model.